My name's Caitlin Rosenthal. I'm an associate professor of history at UC Berkeley, and I have my first book is called Accounting for Slavery: Masters in Management. And what that book is an attempt to write slavery back into American business history. I'm trained as a business historian, and I never intended to write a book about slavery, but kind of knowing about things people describe as the central milestones of American business, when I started looking at plantation records, I found that they were doing many of the same things, and in some cases earlier than you see them in free factories. So I started a project that's framed around milestones in American business. These include things like scientific management, the use of depreciation, keeping standardized records, so not kind of ad hoc records, but rather pre-formatted records where they're highly standardized. And I went through the history of slave plantations in the US South and the British West Indies, so especially Jamaica and Barbados, and then Louisiana, Mississippi, all the way up to Virginia, and documented the ways that they were using these very precise practices at the same time as, and sometimes earlier than, in free factories. And one of the things I argue is that historians had previously thought of advanced management practices as something that always emerged despite slavery. And what I was finding was that actually, for some planters, slavery was a sort of a management advantage. They had so much control over enslaved people that they were able to push up the pace of labor, to record detailed data, and to kind of do the kinds of labor control practices that when people in free factories tried to implement them, they just ended up quitting. If you think about the 19th century, turnover in a free factory is often 100% or more in the course of a year. And so free factories are just struggling to keep people coming to work. By contrast, on a slave plantation, a slave owner is able to manipulate and coerce people without the same kind of resistance as in a free factory. Now, of course, there's all kinds of resistance, but the number of options that enslaved people have available to them is so few, they can't quit, they can't escape. So it gives the planter a tool to do things like ratchet up the pace of labor. And you can see how effective Southern planters were simply just from looking at how productive they were in the big industries of cotton and sugar. And there are two economists, Paul Rohde and Alan Olmsted, who've done really careful analysis of productivity on cotton plantations. And they find that between about 1800 and the US Civil War, the amount of cotton each enslaved person picks goes up something like 4 times. And this is partly because they're growing new types of cotton, but it's also because they're tracking and analyzing people's productivity day to day. Like every single day, year in, year out, they keep track of how much cotton every single person picks every day, which is a kind of degree of specificity and quantification that you don't see in other places. So I'm interested in slavery and business, which of course is a little different from slavery and capitalism, which is one of the things that you've been talking about, I think. And one of the things that I was interested in, and this is not just me, but also a number of other historians who are working in what people sometimes call the new history of capitalism, is how, if we begin from a place where we're not assuming slavery is outside of capitalism, then what new things might we learn about capitalism? So the assumption had sort of been that slavery was in, but not of the capitalist world. So like, of course, slavery was connected to capitalism because people are growing sugar and cotton, and textile mills are weaving cotton into fabric. But why do we have that assumption that they're so separate? And especially, why do we have that assumption if we can see that they have these highly sophisticated management practices? And there's lots of reasons for this, but one reason is that when people go to define capitalism, they often simply define it as being only with wage labor. And so what I got interested in is, well, if we took that out of the equation, then could we see interesting commonalities and ways that slavery was close to or connected with capitalism? And then might that help us to also see ways that capitalism, which is sort of seen as, because it relies on free labor, is seen as being free, could we see ways that capitalism is also highly coercive? And maybe slavery could help us to see the relationship between capitalism and coercion in different settings.
One of the things that we've been talking about in our group, and what comes up a lot, is that capitalism brings, just mentioning it in the context of anything, really just brings up all sorts of loaded associations. So people immediately think that, we're talking about Marxism or socialism, and there's an anti-capitalist slant to it. And there are some of that, obviously, but I was fascinated in reading and looking at your work, how you don't really take a Marxist view of it. You're taking more of a, like, this is what it is. So I'm interested in how you define capitalism in the slavery context, if that makes sense.
So
And
first,
maybe if you could address the controversy too, as to, yeah.
I would say, I teach a class called The History of American Capitalism. And one of the first things we do in the class is that I complain about how capitalism is not a useful word. Like, I think I use it to advertise the class, and then half the students come because they like capitalism, and the other half come because they're against capitalism. And, we start to have on the second day, I think we have a debate about definitions, and it turns out nobody has any of the same ideas. And then also we talk a little bit about the history of the word capitalism, which was a critical term from its inception. And is critical at least through the late 1800s, first 2/3 of the 1900s. And then it starts to occasionally be used as a compliment. And then by the 20th century, politicians have to say that they're in favor of capitalism, but then you can pin them down on what they mean. So, I actually think that for having a clear debate, it's not so useful to talk about capitalism because the word is confusing. On the other hand, it's like the word that we're stuck with. And so if we want to talk about economic conditions today, I try to, in this article, the reason that I have an article and a book that are separate, my book almost never uses the word capitalism because I sort of didn't want these findings about business history to get tangled up with capitalism. At the same time, capitalism is such a powerful word that I think slavery can tell us a lot about capitalism. And so in the article, I argue that instead of using wage labor as a sign of capitalism, we should think about the commodification of labor or the commoditization of labor. And by that, I mean when people think about labor as something that can be bought and sold at will and can be subdivided into units. Typically, we think then of wage labor, but actually, once you look at the records that I use, where you show a person being priced by age or a person being depreciated over time, you can see that, well, the math is a little different, but actually the way that planters are looking at them as like a unit of production is very similar to the way we think about wage labor. And with that, I wanted to think about, well, then what can capitalism tell us about, what can slavery tell us about capitalism? There's a famous sociologist, Orlando Patterson, who once described slavery as capitalism with its clothes off. And I think that's kind of a useful way to think about what slavery is, because it's like if you had no or very few labor regulations, and capital has really a lot of domination over labor, you get something that looks like slavery. I like to think about the U.S. Civil War and the end of slavery as like a success of labor regulation, because all the planters thought that they were having their property and their rights taken away. That's where you get all this language about rights and freedom and how the South is seceding for freedom. And what they mean is their economic rights. They don't mean personal freedoms. And then by contrast, the enslaved people are getting these work protections. They're getting the right to quit, kind of very fundamental rights that now we take for granted, but are still really labor regulations, I think. And I went back and looked at Matthew Desmond's article, which is the economic one. And when I first read it, I thought that I was a little worried about it because I thought he, in a way, overstated the case for a causal story where we sort of argue that slavery caused capitalism. And I think that that's not the most productive discussion to have. It's also a very difficult question to solve. And then I went back and I looked at it, and I think he's sort of careful with his language. He sort of says it can trace its roots back. He doesn't exactly say it caused capitalism, but it does paint. And I think that what the article is most useful for doing is saying, well, look, slavery shaped the form of American capitalism we have today. And I think, but what a lot of people took from the article was slavery caused capitalism. Like slavery instead of other things is the source of American capitalism. And I think that story is probably too simplistic. And I wish we were, instead of debating whether slavery caused capitalism, we were debating, how did slavery shape capitalism? Because that's something that can kind of lead us to a list of things that might lead us to a productive conversation about how to repair those things. So like what is our goal right now? I think in a lot of if I could oversimplify too much, a lot of economists, the goal is economic growth, kind of the more the better. And then from that perspective, it becomes really problematic if you think slavery accelerated American economic growth, which I think certainly in some periods it did. But if you're asking a slightly different question, which is sort of like, how can we have more equitable growth and how can we have a more just economy? Well, then you don't actually need to know how much slavery grew the economy. You need to know, well, what legacies did slavery leave us with today? Which is a similar question, but a slightly different question. And I think it's one where understanding how slavery shaped business practices or something like that can lead you to a set of solutions, things like that could include reparations, but might also include all kinds of other reparative activities.
Right, and I think that's what I found most exciting about your work, is that in dealing with the management aspect of it and business practices, it kind of, as you said, kind of took it out of capitalism and put it back in like, how are management systems working and operating, and then how did they transform? Because I mean, when I was in college, I was incredibly fascinated by scientific management and Taylorism and kind of its effect on the progressive movement, and that's just an aside. So it was really just as a personal interest. It really spoke to me. But getting back to kind of the one of the things that I found about your article that I think maybe you could unpack a little bit is this idea that the enslavers, and maybe kind of talking about how they did this too. The quote I have is, enslavers turned their control over capital into managerial control over labor. So it was not just price, but power. And I think that would be an interesting thing to kind of lead us into kind of then how your research into the management bookkeeping and how they, because I mean, one of the things, well, I'll get to that later, but yeah, maybe if you could just kind of unpack that a little bit.
Well, so if you look at these records, and actually I think there's something like one of the best things that the 1619 Project did was simply to reproduce some of these records and put them in front of people. So they can look at a inventory of enslaved people's lives and see how they're being appreciated and depreciated over time. Look at a record of how much cotton is being picked so you can see how minutely people are tracking productivity. Because like on their own almost, these records dispel some myths about the South. You know, I would hope that we all know that slavery wasn't this like gentle institution that, you know, was good for enslaved people. But then you like go out and you read what people are saying out, and there's still kind of ideas that slavery wasn't about extracting profit. And as soon as you look at these records, you can see that planters are using coercion and violence to get more products out of people. And so like in a certain way, the records speak them themselves. They also show you how someone who has a huge amount of control over someone can translate data into profit. And what I mean by that is I mentioned before this idea that like free workers are just quitting a lot. So I looked at a lot of free labor records, and you sort of see the planter tries to, or not the factory owner tries to do a reform and the people walk out. Or, you know, somebody quits and they go find work at the next factory over. And sometimes factory owners are able to exert this kind of control, but very rarely. And by contrast, I just look at these things and the spreadsheets are just sort of blank. I mean, they're not totally blank, but they're not all filled out. You couldn't use them to calculate pounds per day and set up targets and do precise analysis. By contrast, you look at a record of cotton picking or an inventory of people. It's remarkable how consistent things are. Every single day, day in, day out, you weigh the cotton. And every day, and slave narratives say sometimes it was 3 times a day, you have people being measured and monitored. And interestingly, after the end of slavery, these cotton picking records disappear. They later come back in the 20th century when people are picking for piece rates, but they disappear because people don't want to be surveilled the same way. They want to have some freedom over their day-to-day life. And so they are kind of escaping the surveillance of the scale. And so because planters had this control, they're able to extract more data. And because they can extract more data, they can basically run experiments on people to think about how they can make their plantations more productive. So they take this kind of ownership over people and turn it into control over what they do and how they work. In cotton, this is about pushing up the pace of picking. In sugar, it's about allocating and reallocating labor from task to task. You know, in a modern factory or a factory in the 19th century, people get hired into a job. And every time you want someone to do something different, you have a negotiation. And planters just didn't have to have the same scale of negotiations because they had so much power over people. I mean, and it's not just that they own someone, it's that they have the threat of violence, but also that they have the threat of violence towards loved ones and family. They have control over your lodging. They have control over your food. It's the closest example you can get to it is like a company town where you have everything is in the hands of the factory, and the factory is like has surveillance over people's lives. And so it gives like a huge kind of set of management tools.
And why do you think, just as a kind of an aside, why do you think that the weighing of cotton and kind of the minute control went away? Because I mean, it seems like a lot of the systems that the freed people were granted were quickly reestablished. Or, you know, the slavery system was kind of reestablished, not as harshly, of course, but like Jim Crow and the futures, you know, those things came right almost immediately. So why do you think that the planters gave up on this kind of like, yeah?
Well, so, you know, when you look at what happens after emancipation, it's like such a double story, right? Because on the one hand, Jim Crow reemerges. We have the rise of like convict labor. We have all kinds of new racist mechanisms of control that are coming to reassert power over enslaved people. On the other hand, I think that the negotiation between enslaved people and planters that results in the emergence of sharecropping does reflect both sides getting some of the things they cared about. And like, so for example, some of the things we know is that these records have disappeared. We know that enslaved people withdrew their labor from the fields, especially the labor of their children. They didn't want their children, the freed people didn't want their children laboring under the kind of watch of an overseer. Women withdrew more labor from the fields so they could spend more time at home. And so you have like a shift to a system of sharecropping or even a system of debt peonage, where on the one hand, you don't get any kind of financial independence or freedom for the formerly enslaved people. Freed people don't win like economic mobility. So this ends up being tragic. And then having not won economic mobility, you have racism coming in through Jim Crow to like further restrict their freedom. On the other hand, they do in many cases escape the constant surveillance of the planter and escape, have some control over their day-to-day lives. Because even if sharecropping maybe puts you into debt, it means that you have some freedom in your day. And I think this reflects, on the one hand, it's a really tragic story, so I don't want to make it out to be better than it is. But on the other hand, it reflects kind of like, what do people think of when they meant freedom? And we tend to think, well, freedom means freedom to work for a wage. But I think freedom was actually bigger than that for many of enslaved people. It meant freedom to be with their families, freedom to control their daily movement, freedom to kind of be in touch with the kind of rhythms of time in a way where they weren't being constantly followed, constantly watched, and constantly surveilled. So it's a victory in control over your daily life. It's sort of a victory in terms of freedom. If there'd been a successful Reconstruction, maybe that victory could have been extended to be bigger and better eventually, but it ends up kind of collapsing and, you know, doesn't actually provide any economic mobility. The other thing that's interesting is that I think you have previously the control was exercised mostly through force, and you have debt coming in as a new form of control. So even if people are not subject to the same kinds of violence, although, you know, the rise of lynching, and I mean, there's other kinds of violence that are on the rise. So you can't forget violence, but the rise of debt as a way to control people is a kind of new a new mechanism that sort of looks more like what we think of as capitalism, but in a way is actually a sort of similar system substituting for what came before.
Yeah, and it seems like the ability not to be, like, as you say, some social stability, like not the threat of being sold or moved against your will is not as pressing as like, oh, I'm in debt to the landowner for $1.50. You know, and $1.50 would mean a lot more back then, but then like that's not the same. It's an economic violence, but it's not a physical violence. So
well, and it's not the same as the threat that you might be sold or something, or your child will be sold, or these kinds of like really. So it's like, I mean, this is the thing I go back to, is like about the comparison, thinking about emancipation as a labor regulation. Like on the one hand, it's such a massively important and very successful regulation. On the other hand, it falls totally short in terms of actually giving people the, if it's supposed to be a way to have economic and social mobility, it falls short.
Right. One of the last questions we have is like, how does this act, so today, how is it translated into what's going on today? So when you talked about the 1619 article, it kind of overstates it, but how would you see management having been found, you know, what continues today from slavery, or what was influenced by slavery that continues today?
So you know, the 1619 article is interesting, and I think it depends what you're looking for in it. On the very big picture, I think it's 100% correct. I mean, I think it's just trying to argue that slavery was a big deal economically, and it's formative to the emergence of American capitalism, and I think that that's true. I think if you're to read it in a vacuum and think it's saying that slavery is like the cause of slavery caused capitalism, like that, I think that that's probably not true. But I think if you give it a nuanced reading, then it's about showing us that slavery was a big economic deal, that it was a big economic deal because it married violence with innovation in a really scary way. And so I think that there's two big ways that it can be useful to us today. One is sort of by analogy, and the other is by tracing the whole thing forward. The way by analogy is, you know, I worked for a while as a management consultant, and I just, you know, there's just always this assumption that if something is creative and innovative, then it's also going to be somehow good. That if we just crunch the data, we'll come up with the most profitable way, that profitable way will also be a way that is compatible with like freedom or something like that. And I think slavery is just such a powerful counterexample. I mean, that sometimes this thing that is innovative and profitable is also horribly violent and extremely immoral. And facing that can help us to realize that you sometimes have to make difficult choices. There's like a mythology that says that like doing well and doing good always go together. And I think hoping that that's true makes it so hard to recognize that you actually do have to make trade-offs. I think of even to go like kind of far afield, like the opioid crisis stories about Purdue Pharma and how they're chasing profits and like trying to, like, this is like, if you think that being clever and finding out the best way to crunch your data and increase your profits is gonna, whatever the outcome is gonna be okay. Like, this is just such, if we spent more time as business people reflecting on bad businesses and how profitable they've often been, I think it'd be really good for us. But the second one, of course, is I think the one you were asking about, which is sort of like, we have this legacy of slavery with us today. And this is particularly important in the US, but also in the whole, it's important also in the Caribbean and in Britain, which we're all part of the same massive slave system. And I think the wealth, like, I think I'm in favor of making a case for reparations. And reparations is something that's owed to Black Americans, not just because of slavery, but because of the ways slavery created debts that were then extended and multiplied over time. So you come out of slavery, and not only do you come out of slavery with, you don't have any redistribution of land or wealth. In fact, the land all goes back to the former enslavers. So there from the beginning, you're starting out very unequal. But then even more. You have the failure of Reconstruction. You have the rise of Jim Crow. You have all the way through to redlining, where you've had moments where we look like we're narrowing the wage gap, narrowing the wealth gap, and then outright discrimination prevents that from happening. And so both American descendants of slaves and then also other Black Americans have kind of experienced these cascading tides of racism. And, sometimes people say, when they see the kind of documents that I work with, they say, well, do you have the data? And it's like, well, we got plenty of data. And I think there's lots of good ways to make a calculation. And the thing that we're lacking is the kind of political commitment to make some kind of reparative action. And I don't think there's like any right number, but I do think there's some kind of action is necessary, and something that takes account of both slavery and then also like everything that's happened since then.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that we always end up talking about in our discussions is the fact that Black people were some of the first, or slaves were some of the first mortgages that were taken out, and how that whole system, it didn't obviously start in slavery, but was a big part of the mortgage industry. What needs to be accounted for in some way. And one of the most devastating moments in our discussion was this older lady has been doing her ancestry. And the first time she saw her whole family together was in one of these overseer lists.
Yeah.
And then she saw how much each one was worth. And it was just, she said she didn't want to do ancestry anymore, and took about a month off and was just completely devastated by it. And then it kind of set in, and then she could continue to do the research. But it was once she got some distance on it. But at the same time, it's interesting to see as historians, as you're saying, yes, we have the data, but then yes, we also have the people whose lives are being. And that was one of the things I liked about your book too, was you kind of teased out how some of the slave rebellions or resistance was documented in these documents and these figures.
I mean, the documents are really, it's very powerful to think about the people in them as individuals. And so to think about finding your own family. Mm-hmm. And either to find your own family listed as in an inventory, or to find that your family's on the other side of this and is owning people and is just pricing them in this kind of inhumane way. And then also to think about how these records are just so matter of fact. They show someone doing this, kind of doing their business just as if the people were bales of cotton. It's very, I think it makes clear that reparations isn't some kind of, it's about something, a debt that is owed, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's also just about kind of acknowledging the magnitude of the wrong, and thinking about kind of how to repair it. And it's a really tough thing for, it's interesting to think about genealogy, because it's really tough if you're a descendant of slaves to do genealogy, because say you finally make it back to this inventory and then there are no last names. The record, maybe you can't find an inventory, the record runs dry. So you can just see that the control over the planter's control, the planter who it's really easy to trace in the records, is there. And then the kind of agency of the people, is not. Right. That's an interesting, amazing story.
I think the last thing is the thing that the 1619 article brings up is the low road capitalism. And that definition, and in your article, you kind of touch on that too, how there's these subgenres of capitalism that have kind of emerged through talking about. And I guess this kind of goes back to our definition of what capitalism is. But how do you feel about those kind of subgenre categorizations of capitalism?
Well, it's part of it is the word is just so confusing and leads to so much conflict. But I do think that the benefit of those sub-classifications of capitalism, calling it low road capitalism, is that it seems like something that's useful for understanding the present. Whereas if we just talk about slavery as something so separate that's gone, then whatever it could teach us about the present gets missed. But if we talk about it as part of a low road capitalism, then maybe we can identify other kinds of low road capitalisms, like the Purdue Pharma thing, like all kinds of settings where we have in our COVID circumstances, workers having to go back to work when they're ill, having no sick leave. These are clearly must be low road capitalism, whatever that is, where it's coercive. I mean, there's some really striking, I had looked at one record book where there was a measles outbreak on the plantation, and to watch the way that the planter got the people with measles back to work, like they went back to work in their separate group. So I guess they wouldn't infect other people. I'm not sure how much they understood about the contagiousness, but they could go back to work at a slower pace in a separate group. It just rung very true with the present, where we're seeing the virus is an opportunity for some businesses. And it's also, whether we have the luxury of working at home in a safe condition is it's not the same as slavery, definitely not. But there's a form of coercion there. If your housing and your livelihood is at risk unless you go to work in an unsafe condition. So I think that term is really useful, and it at least helps us to be talking about it in the same conversation as the kind of our current economy.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think those are the kind of beats down all the rusty nails that have been sticking up in our discussions, where a lot of people would take umbrage at the subgenre of low road capitalism, and what does that mean? I've never heard that before, and management techniques and that kind of stuff. But so it's.
The other good thing about low road, is it preserves the space for a better capitalism.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe there are people who think, anything to do with capitalism needs to be tossed out as well. But maybe this means that we could find, people talk about Nordic capitalism, or capitalism with a better social welfare net. Maybe people talk about racial capitalism. Well, can we get to a post-racial capitalism? So maybe there's an optimistic side to talking about the bad stuff also.
Right. And I think that's what I'm trying to do that in the discussions is we're not talking about necessarily getting rid of this. We're just talking about an aspect of the history of it, which I don't know why people get so, I know why they get so upset. But
and everybody's cranky these days.
Everybody's cranky, yes. But it's interesting because in Cleveland Heights, where I live, we're about 60-40 African American. And all the essential workers, though, it's more like 90-10%. And it's just been very striking to walk into a grocery store or a Walmart or something else and just see that kind of that stark reality of, oh, right, these are the people that we're saying are not only essential, but also kind of saying we can put them at risk. And it's noticeable. And it's not just,
I was just, our numbers are not too bad out here, but I was looking at our county numbers and the proportion of cases among African Americans, and then even more so Latina people out here is just way out of proportion. It's these are people who don't have another option. And this is not the same as slavery, but it's a form of coercion. Right. And we need to think about that when we're thinking about how we can make capitalism, whatever it is, work better for everybody.